Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the George C. Marshall Exhibit Dedication Ceremony. Our host for today's ceremony is the 37th Chief of Staff of the Army, General Martin E. Dempsey. Ladies and gentlemen, General Dempsey.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to be able to preside over this event, which is not the first time, by the way, as most of you know, that we have christened, if you will, or dedicated a corridor to General Marshall. We just keep changing the Pentagon, and so from time to time, we have the opportunity to remember his contributions. Mr. Secretary, good of you to be here, Mr. Shaw. As always, thanks for what you do with the foundation and what you do for those cadets down at the Virginia Military Institute. Undersecretary of the Army, Chief, good to see you, sir. General Gorman, who was, of course, my closest confidant at Training and Doctrine Command, and as many of you know, the real brains behind General Depew. Well, at least that's the way I looked at it. It is a privilege for me to be here, and I thank you for joining us, fellow general officers and distinguished guests. I already mentioned General Meyer. We're here today to dedicate this corridor in honor of General George C. Marshall. This is the third time, actually, in 35 years, that a group has gathered in the Pentagon to dedicate a corridor to General Marshall. Not only have we, through several rounds of renovation, had the opportunity to update the displays, but the ceremonies that we've held on each of those occasions have allowed us to reflect on what it means to be a leader of consequence and a leader for life, because that's really what General Marshall exemplifies in our professional lives. Today, more than 130 years after George Marshall was born, in an era defined by prolonged conflict, it is fitting that we pause just for a moment and consider what his example means to us. George C. Marshall may best be known for serving as Chief of Staff of the Army during the Second World War. In a matter of just a few short years, he organized and led the expansion of the Army from an Army that was the 16th ranked in the world into a force that won a global war fought on two fronts. I can't sum it up any better than did President Harry Truman, who wrote, in paraphrasing something that was actually said about Washington years earlier, that George Marshall was first in war, first in peace, and first in the role of helping to rebuild and reshape the post-war free world. There is no better example of the kind of leader we need today than General George C. Marshall. He was a military leader and a statesman, a visionary and a taskmaster. He understood that trust was the foundation of the military profession, and he was deeply committed to the development of Army leaders. And today, around the world, our young men and women in uniform fight, they mediate among warring factions, and they rebuild villages. General Marshall would be proud of today's Army and its men and women. George Marshall said, "It's not enough to fight. It's the spirit which we bring to the fight that ultimately decides the issue. It is morale that wins the victory." In dedicating the Marshall Corridor, once again, we call attention to the role of leadership and the spirit of commitment of which George C. Marshall is our finest example. Now I'd like to welcome Mr. Brian Shaw, President of the George C. Marshall Foundation. Thank you all for your hospitality and your presence here today. Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Secretary, General Dempsey, General Meyer, General Gorman, General Dyke, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a sincere pleasure to offer remarks here on behalf of the George C. Marshall Foundation upon the occasion of this special event. We are deeply grateful to the United States Army, particularly Rob D'Alessandro and his team of excellent historians, for preparing this wonderful exhibit. This event is the kind of event that would have made General Marshall a little uncomfortable. Practically every event that called attention to General Marshall made him uneasy. He much preferred to stay in the background and let others, particularly his soldiers, take the limelight and the credit. Yet, as a lifelong student of history and a strong advocate for the study of history, particularly among young people, General Marshall would understand why this exhibition is so important in this hallowed space. As the exhibit so aptly and thoroughly describes, George Catlett Marshall spent his entire life in service to our nation. In doing so, he rose to the highest ranks of military and civilian leadership. He was, as Harry Truman described him, the great one of the age. The panels in this exhibition tell the story of a man whose selfless service continues to shape and influence the world today. Marshall touched almost every event of the first half of the 20th century in which our nation took its rightful place in leading the nations of the world. Marshall's shadow remains long, and his example and influence remain widely admired. General Colin Powell said Marshall was truly one of the greatest Americans who ever lived. The quiet power of the man lay in his utter selflessness. It lay in the dignity that emerges from every photograph you've seen of him. It lay in his hard work and his immense personal sacrifice. It lay in his compassion and his wisdom. George Marshall practically defined those virtues, General Powell said, yet he would have thought it odd if we had tried to congratulate him for these things. To him, those were the virtues that were simply executed as a citizen of our country. While none of us can be exactly like General Marshall, we can all aspire to emulate his examples of integrity, selflessness, and dedication. It is our sincere hope that this exhibition will inform and inspire generations of soldiers and leaders as they walk down this corridor, and to reflect on the greatness of a great man and to aspire to his ideal. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, General Dempsey and General Meyer will cut the ribbon.
These are real.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are now welcome to tour the exhibit. This concludes today's ceremony. Thank you.
You know, the tradition was that he won 3 DSMs in his life. No, I'm sorry, he won 2 DSMs. That's this one. He won 2 of those, and the tradition was that no one could ever have more than 2, because he had 2. But during this conflict, that tradition was broken. But it stood since, from 40, roughly, 45, 46, really till 2005.
Who was there reading the Army magazine?
But at any rate,
But he chose sometimes to wear 9, and sometimes a row of 3, and you'll see other pictures where they just have a row of 1. A very modest approach.
Listening to the 5-star. Or is that a 2-star?
When he gave, because remember now, there was no joint staff in those days, so he was giving orders to the theater commanders, MacArthur in the Pacific, Eisenhower in the Atlantic. This is the order he gave them for the invasion of Europe. Across the channel, enter Germany, through the continent. Can you imagine this today? We'd publish something that would be this thick. Isn't that great?